inflation down.
Order. Just ask members to take their seats quickly and quietly. In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. But before I call on questions, I'd like to inform the House that seated in the Distinguished Visitors Gallery is the Right Honourable Chris Hipkins MP, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, accompanied by Her Excellency the Honourable Dame Annette King, High Commissioner for New Zealand. A very warm welcome to you both. And I call the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I add to your warm welcome of Prime Minister Hipkins? We had a very constructive meeting today. Australia and New Zealand are not just friends, we're family. And we engage in our economic relationship, which is so important. Probably the CER is the world-class example of the best free trade agreement you could possibly have. And it is indeed, on top of that as well, the migration issues. We're working through streamlining citizenship arrangements between Australia and New Zealand. We hope to conclude those matters prior to Anzac Day. We will be co-hosts of the Women's World Cup later this year. That is the third most watched event in the world after the Men's World Cup and the Olympic Games. A big deal for Australia and New Zealand. I look forward to continuing our close relationship between our countries, and I know that this is an issue as well that goes right across the chamber. We are friends, we will remain friends, and you are a very warm welcome, and thank you for giving us the honour of being your first international visit here in Australia. It says a lot.
And I give the call to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On behalf of the Coalition, extend a very warm welcome to Prime Minister Hipkins. Congratulate him on his election and his appointment to this position. Acknowledge also the High Commissioner, who's a very good friend of our country. We speak in a united front in relation to our relationship with our friends just across the ditch. It's a very integral part of our family, and it's more important than ever that our two countries come together to stand for the values that we fought together for over a long period of time, and the engagement that New Zealand has with many smaller nations, in particular in the Indo-Pacific. That relationship is more crucial than ever. So we look forward to the occasions where we can continue to work together, and the occasions particularly around rugby and cricket, where we can agree to disagree in a time-honoured tradition. But you're a most welcome guest here, and it's a great pleasure and honour to have you in the chamber.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today, a ninth interest rate rise since May is widely expected. 3 months out from the election, the Prime Minister committed to reducing costs for families and promised, in his words, Australians will be better off under a Labor government. But a rate increase today would mean the typical family is paying $1,400 more each month on their mortgage without taking into account increases in grocery and power bills. So I ask the Prime Minister, why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Order. Order. There's far too much noise on my left and my right. It is the first question, and I'll hear from the Prime Minister.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. And indeed, Australians, when they went to their chemist from any time from January 1, were better off. Were better off because of the reduction from $42.50 down to $30, the first reduction in 75 years.
Member for Groom.
Australians will also benefit who want to get the skills that Australia needs when they enrol in a TAFE course, because 180,000 of them will be fee-free as a result of the measures that we have put in place. Australians as well will be better off who have children in childcare as a result of the measures that will benefit some 1.2 million Australian families in July. The fact is The fact is we are acting responsibly. We are taking
Minister for
targeted
Infrastructure will
relief
cease interjecting.
to take pressure off. Cheaper medicines, cheaper childcare, energy price relief, paid parental leave, fee-free TAFE, all of these measures are there. And of course, interest rates started to increase under the former government. And before the election, they said that they acknowledged that that was an inevitable consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, placing pressure on supply chains and placing pressure on inflation globally. But when it comes to supply chains, of course, there's another measure that's before this parliament, the National Reconstruction Fund, something that is placing pressure on inflation as a result of our failure to build things here, to make things here in Australia. And those opposite have turned the coalition again back into the no-alition. They not only want to bring Tony Abbott back onto their Senate benches, but they want to go back to the policies where they just said no to absolutely everything. So the political party that told the car industry to leave are going to oppose a National Reconstruction Fund that the business community, that the Australian Industry Group and others are crying out for, to make us more competitive, to grow our economy, to grow jobs, because they've absolutely learnt nothing. The Leader of the Opposition this morning spoke about bad luck. Well, it wasn't bad luck to leave Australia with $1 trillion of debt. It was a bad government. And it wasn't bad luck.
Order.
That inflicted a decade of wage stagnation. It was bad policy, a deliberate policy from those opposite to undermine wages and to drive wages down as a key feature of their economic.
Order. When the House comes to silence, I'll hear from the member for Paterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry and Science. What is the Albanese Labor government doing for the Australian manufacturing industry so that it can generate secure, well-paid jobs? And is this plan threatened by any recent developments?
We'll give the call to the order. Members on my left, the member for Hume. And the member for Groom is now warned because he's been continually interjecting within 5 minutes of question time. Give the call to the Minister for Industry and Science.
Thanks, Speaker, and thanks to the member for Paterson, who knows the importance of manufacturing to regional communities. I appreciate the question. Now, we went through this seismic event of the pandemic where we discovered that the things we needed most weren't there at a time we needed them. We realised we were dependent on a couple of countries for all these goods that got imported, and that we recognised our supply chains were completely dependent on them. And we thought at that point in time we as a country had learned that lesson and that we would commit to do better, because Australians recognise we have to be a country that makes things. And modern economies need strong manufacturing capability if they're going to keep going on into the long term. And manufacturing matters because it generates full-time, secure, well-paying jobs. And with all that in mind, that is why we have committed, the Albanese government has committed to one of the largest investments in Australian manufacturing capabilities in peacetime, the $15 billion National Reconstruction Fund that will look at priority areas, value-adding resources, value-adding agriculture, looking at low-emissions technology manufacture, transport, in medical sciences and, importantly, critical technologies that will be important to give the economy edge longer term. Independently run, with an investment mandate, looking at delivering a return to the taxpayer, building capability, and not a colour-coded spreadsheet in sight. Politicians not making the call, the investment decisions made in the national interest, not in political interest. And given all that, what happens?
Members on my left, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
The no-alition roars back. The no-alition roars back to life. The unreconstructed Tony Abbotts There's no doubt their National Unreconstruction Fund in the wings there. There they are, wanting to say no to growing the economy, wanting to say no to growing jobs, wanting to say no to Australian manufacturing, wanting to stop that longer-term benefit that's required. And their criticisms from a bunch of people who brought you sports rorts, they brought you regional rorts, and they spent in the weeks leading into election manufacturing grants not being there, only interested in manufacturing when it manufactures a vote. That is the only time they are interested. Being lectured on transparency when they had a secret industry minister in their ranks. And they're telling us we should be transparent. I mean, please, it is a joke. We will do what's right for this country. We will make sure manufacturing is revitalised. We'll do the right thing.
There is far too much noise in the chamber. I want to hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition in silence, and I'll give her the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Before the election, the Prime Minister promised he would deliver a $275 cut to power prices, cheaper mortgages, cheaper groceries and government by renewal, not revolution. Instead, power prices are rising, mortgages are more expensive, inflation continues to climb, and the Treasurer's only answer is to remake capitalism. Why do Australian families always pay more under Labor?
Members on my right, the Treasurer will cease interjecting, so will the Minister for Infrastructure. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much. I thank the member for his question and for her question, and I go to. I do say this. I do say this. We're not on the side of energy bosses. We're on the side of consumers and business. I do say that. When it comes to energy prices, not only do I say that, that's a direct quote from the New South Wales Treasurer when standing up supporting action to reduce the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the pressure that's there on inflation, when the New South Wales government, along with every other state and territory government in the country, joined with the federal government last year when we both recalled our respective parliaments to take action. And then you had to decide whose side you were on. We, unashamedly, were on the side of consumers, whether it be small business, large business for that matter, manufacturing, or whether it be consumers as well. Those opposite voted against that legislation, But I'm asked about energy policy. And of course, the Energy Shadow Minister isn't here. He's off in Japan. Doing work. And I was wondering, I thought I might get a question from him on why he wasn't here yesterday. But Ted O'Brien has gone to Japan, and you can pick that out because Ted O'Brien goes to Japan. He's been researching his solution. And on a YouTube video that he's put up on his site, not verbling him at all, it's got this: time to talk nuclear. What can we learn from Hiroshima? What can we learn from Hiroshima?
Order. The House will come to order. Members on my left and right.
Not a complex question.
The Leader of the Nationals and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
He also visited Fukushima. So here in Australia, this government is working with state and territory governments, Labor and Liberal, to do what we can to alleviate the pressure that's on prices. And over there, the Shadow Minister is off on this frolic of nuclear energy, even though we know it's the most expensive form possible
the Prime Minister
for Australia.
Will pause. I'll call the leader. I'll call the member for Petrie on a point of order.
Why is it all right for the Prime Minister to fly around the world but not the Shadow Minister?
I'll deal with the Prime Minister. Order. The Prime Minister will just resume for one moment. This is order. The House will come to order. Members on my left will cease interjecting immediately. The member for Petrie has abused the standing order. I want to be crystal clear before Christmas. I said if that happened, there would be consequences. The consequences is you'll leave the chamber under 94A. I want to be very clear with people. I will take points of relevance. They have to be within the standing orders. If they are abused, there will be immediate action. The Prime Minister has 12 seconds remaining in his answer.
There are alleviating circumstances because he has not got a question, not one question, a member of the front bench during this entire term. But nor are there as the member for Aston and a number of their other front bench members as well.
Order.
They remain silent,
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister's time has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Lyons.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. What steps is the Albanese Labor government taking to ensure Australians have access to fast, reliable and affordable broadband?
Give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lyons for his question. The Albanese government is committed to driving economic and social inclusion through fast, reliable and affordable broadband. Broadband isn't a nice-to-have, it's essential, like electricity and water. But too many Australians have a connection that's slow and unreliable. In many cases, that's a result of inferior copper infrastructure. And that's why this government is delivering a better national broadband network.
Manager of Opposition
We've delivered
Business.
$480 million for NBN's fixed wireless network upgrade, extending coverage to another 120,000 premises that are currently on satellite. And in the October budget, we committed to upgrade an additional 1.5 million premises to full fibre by the end of 2025. And importantly, over 660,000 of these premises are in regional Australia. These upgrades will create thousands of jobs for construction workers, engineers and project managers in our suburbs and our regions. But importantly, these upgrades will drive productivity. Only a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of visiting a fantastic small business in Adelaide, Chloe's Creative Co, that's already reaping the benefits of an upgrade from copper to fibre technology. Chloe's a young mum and she's running a consultancy from home. She said her fibre upgrade is a game changer. Her uploads and downloads are faster, her connection is better quality and she's able to spend more time growing her business rather than dealing with dropouts. These, Mr Speaker, are the tangible economic dividends that come from reliable broadband, and that is what the Albanese government is delivering. But, Mr Speaker, our approach also places greater emphasis on affordability. We've reset the NBN special access undertaking process. We have reversed a proposal made under the former government that, if implemented, would have allowed broadband prices to increase by more than CPI on some products. And finally, Mr Speaker, the pandemic showed us that there were tens of thousands of families right around Australia who, for whatever reason, did not have any access to the internet. And that meant that during remote learning, children in these households were at a distinct disadvantage. And that's why last week the government launched our $4.5 million school student broadband initiative. It's an affordability measure to enable up to 30,000 unconnected families to access free broadband for 12 months, so those kids in their families are not left behind. With funding from this government in the October budget, NBN Co is partnering with state and territory education bodies, charities and community groups to identify recipients of this program. So across speed, reliability and affordability, this government is delivering a better NBN that all Australians deserve.
Give the call to the honourable member for Kennedy.
Health Minister, are you aware that bone marrow registration has shrunk? Yet recently 300,000 private funding tripled registrations. Overseas donor tissue cheek swab programs introduced here with publicity, uni colleges, military, public service, donor age up to 40. Minister, couldn't we save 1,000 lives? Bonnie Black battles for a life in Charters Towers. 14-year-old Maggie at Cronulla. Too late for 13-year-old Missy at Malanda. 4-year-old Robbie, little sister Sophie, pray to Jesus for their dad, Liam O'Brien.
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Kennedy for his question on this very important health challenge that is facing so many Australians. I also want to thank the member for, first of all, bringing this issue to my attention yesterday, but also arranging our meeting that we had together with Liam and Josephine, as Liam faces a really difficult battle against leukaemia. And Liam is not just in the fight of his life, for his life. He and Josephine have brought enormous energy and time and resources, fundraising, media appearances to draw attention to an area of healthcare that frankly has moved too slowly in this country. So I thank him for his question today and for that engagement over the last 24 hours. In his absence, I also want to acknowledge that the Chief Opposition Whip, the member for Forde, and I had a discussion about this issue in the chamber just yesterday afternoon. As the member knows, and many others will, bone marrow donations provide the stem cells that are required for stem cell transplants, some life-saving treatments today for people who are fighting leukaemia or a range of other blood cancers. It's clear to me, though, that Australia has not moved fast enough to enable more effective matching of bone marrow donors with patients like Liam and so many others that the member mentioned in his question. It's also clear to me that our bone marrow donation system in Australia is too small. There aren't enough people on the registry. It's too slow, and it's not kept up with international standards, including on things like cheek swabs and age limits on donors. We know that cheek swabs are an effective and very economical way of bringing additional donors to the registry and giving people like Liam and so many others a different, better chance at life. Used across the world, this is not a system that's yet been introduced in Australia. What isn't clear to me, though, is why Australia has moved so slowly over the past decade in particular, compared to some of the other countries that Liam and the member and Josephine mentioned to me yesterday. It seems, as unfortunately is so often the case in health policy, that part of the problem is that no single government between the Commonwealth and the states and the territories has sole responsibility or sole authority to make sure that Australia keeps pace with the rest of the world and these advances in technology. And frankly, as the member knows, as I think all members know, in cases like this, that's just not good enough. So after my meeting with the member for Kennedy yesterday and Liam and Josephine, I'm writing right now to the Chair of Health Ministers to seek their agreement to cut through some of this jurisdictional bureaucratic red tape, to do everything we can that is to clear the way that is currently denying patients in Australia the best chance to access this life-saving technology.
Give the call to the member for Fremantle.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy. How is the Albanese Labor government taking action after a wasted decade to build a cleaner, more reliable energy future while helping Australians with cost of living pressures?
Give the call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Fremantle for his question and, of course, his leadership in all matters climate and environment related over his time in this parliament. And as he knows and as the House knows, this government was elected with a mandate of rebuilding Australia's energy system after 10 years of denial and delay and dysfunction, Mr Speaker. And we did that with a view to building our energy grid to become 82% renewable by 2030, which is ambitious but achievable, and we will be world-leading when we achieve it. And of course, Mr Speaker, we've started implementing the policies to do just that. Importantly, rewiring our country, rewiring the nation, our commitment to rebuild our energy grid. And just before Christmas, the Prime Minister and I went to the Hunter Valley to join with the Premier and Energy Minister of New South Wales to announce our New South Wales commitments on rewiring the nation. $7.8 billion total of funding, which will unleash renewable investment right across New South Wales. I know the member for New England hates renewable investment, including in his electorate, but the people of New South Wales welcome it, Mr Speaker, because this will create 3,900 jobs right across New South Wales. And of course this builds on our previous commitments, the governments of Victoria and Tasmania. And in Victoria, our commitments create 2,000 jobs, and of course, importantly, Mariner Slink.
which will provide the second and third links between Tasmania and the mainland and will enable Tasmania to reach 200% renewables, Mr Speaker, creating 2,800 jobs in the process. We understand that emissions down and jobs up is the driving motivation of rebuilding our energy grid and unleashing that renewable investment. And of course, we're also implementing the capacity investment mechanism agreed unanimously by myself on behalf of the Commonwealth and every state and territory minister, again just before Christmas, which will unleash a minimum, conservatively, $10 billion worth of investment and 6 gigawatts of clean, dispatchable power, Mr Speaker. Now, that's very important because over the last decade we saw, as the House might recall, 4 gigawatts leave the grid and only 1 gigawatt of dispatchable energy come onto the grid, which is a big part of the challenge we are facing today. And of course, we've also abolished the member for Hume's failed underwriting new generation investment scheme and recommitted the money to a big battery program. And I was pleased to announce 8 big batteries at a cost of $179 million just before Christmas, Mr Speaker. That is what good government does. Gets on with the job. Doesn't delay, doesn't deny, doesn't dissemble, gets on with the job. That's what the Albanese government's doing, because we know that the cheapest form of energy is renewable energy. We don't need to go to Japan to make videos in Hiroshima about energy. We're getting on with the job.
Minister's time has expired. Before I call the member for Flinders, I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is Gretel Buata, a Commonwealth Games gold medalist with the Australian Diamonds netball team. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome. I give the call to the member for Flinders.
My question is to the Prime Minister. An elderly couple in my electorate of Flinders, Joe and Julie Saragusa, were contacted by their energy company in January and were advised they were facing an increase of over $667 on their gas bill over the next 12 months. This is the very opposite of the Prime Minister's promised $275 reduction in power prices. Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Give the call to the Prime Minister. Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister will be heard in silence. Give a call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Flinders for her question, and I say that we acknowledge that there are cost of living pressures on Australian families at the moment, which is why we don't sit back and do nothing about it, which is why we don't vote against it, which is why we come in here and we take action. We take action in the short term and in the long term, which is why we introduced the legislation and brought Parliament back last December. And I don't understand why those opposite came in here and voted against that change, including the member for Flinders.
Order.
Because as the New South Wales Premier said at the time, this is focused on putting downward pressure on household bills right across New South Wales. He said this: "We know it's a difficult time, and I think the country coming together to deal with this across party political lines shows the maturity that we have to make sure we're putting people first, not playing politics and getting to a point where households and businesses across our state are in a much better position in what will be a difficult time with rising electricity prices." Now, those opposite used to acknowledge that there was an issue with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the pressure that was placing on energy prices.
The Leader of the Nationals.
But now they don't seem to acknowledge that at all. But the business community certainly get it. The business community absolutely get it, which is why the Manufacturing Australia, the peak organ.
The Prime Minister will pause. I will hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, it's a point of order on relevance, Mr Speaker. Joe and Julie Saragusa are facing an increase of over $667 on their gas bill. What is your message for them?
Well, on the point of order, I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
The point of order. It's very clear when a question is asked about using an individual as a reference, it's completely in order to talk about the policy area. Completely in order.
The question was about energy prices. The Prime Minister is being directly relevant by talking about energy prices. There was individuals mentioned in the question. He's referring to the policy, and I'll invite him to continue his answer.
Thanks. The question was about consumers and energy policy and the price. Here's what Energy Consumers Australia CEO said. We applaud and support all elements of the proposed gas market reforms. That's what they said. The Australian Industry Group said, Innes Willox, by passing legislation to enable temporary gas price caps, the Parliament has taken badly needed action that will help energy users and soften the blow to Australia from events in Europe. The Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott, said, it's good that state and federal governments have found a way through. Australia's energy system has been stuck in a loop for too long, and Australians are paying the long-term price of short-term action. And that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Rod Sims, ACCC, said this is inherently a sensible thing to do. And indeed it was, which is why it's absolutely extraordinary that those opposite voted for higher prices and voted against it.
Expired. Give the call to the member for Fraser.
My question is to the Treasurer. What does the Independent Reserve Bank's decision on interest rates mean for Australians?
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Fraser for his question and for his work in this place, particularly when it comes to the economy and economic policy, which I personally appreciate a great deal. As expected, Mr Speaker, the Independent Reserve Bank has just announced its decision to increase interest rates by another 25 basis points. That brings the cash rate to 3.35%. Now, each of these interest rate rises, which began before the election, have put extra pressure on Australians and put extra pressure on the Australian economy as well. And I think we understand in this place, certainly the Australian community understands, that the Reserve Bank makes these decisions independently, and it's not our job in this place to interfere or to second-guess their decision-making or pressure them in any way. It's our job to focus on the broader pressures that are coming at us from around the world and being felt around the kitchen tables of this country. And our plan to address this high inflation, which is causing these rising interest rates, has three main parts to it. The first is to deliver responsible cost-of-living relief in a way that doesn't add to inflation and which has an economic dividend. Think cheaper early childhood education, cheaper medicines, and also taking some of the sting out of these electricity price rises that we expect to see in our economy. The second part of our plan is obviously to deal with the issues in our supply chains and in our workforce. I commend the Minister for Industry, the Minister for Skills and Training and other ministers who are working diligently to deal with these supply chain issues which have been pushing up inflation in our economy in conjunction with the pressures coming at us from around the world. And the third part of our plan is to show spending restraint which would be unrecognisable to those opposite, Mr Speaker. And we saw that in the October budget, banking 99% of the upward revenue surge over the next 2 years. You see that in payments falling in real terms over the next 2 years. You see that in real spending being essentially flat over the forward estimates. And that approach has been endorsed by the IMF just last week, Mr Speaker. They said it's supportive, our approach is supportive of the approach being taken by the Reserve Bank. And in reaffirming Australia's AAA credit rating recently, agencies such as Standard & Poor's, Fitch and Morningstar have all pointed to the government's spending restraint and broadly neutral fiscal stance. Mr Speaker, inflation is unacceptably high. There's no use pretending otherwise. It will hang around for longer than we'd like, but there is growing evidence that inflation is expected to have peaked in our economy and is now beginning to moderate. Our job, the responsibility that we take, is to do what we can to address these inflationary pressures in our economy and to take the pressure off Australians where we responsibly can.
Give the call to the honourable member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Nippies, a family-run food manufacturer located in my electorate, is facing a 92.5% annual increase on their energy contract. That's an increase, Prime Minister, of more than $900,000. Prime Minister, why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Order. There is far too much. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Assistant Treasurer will also cease interjecting so I can hear from the Prime Minister in silence. Call the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Barker for his question about increased prices for manufacturers. And the same person who came in here in December and voted against lower prices for manufacturers. Manufacturers are getting hit by higher gas prices.
Members on my left, there is far too much noise during question time. I cannot hear a word that is being said.
And
I call the Prime Minister.
And what we did, along with state and territory governments, along with the sectors such as working with the Australian Industry Group and Australian manufacturers, along with energy consumer groups, was to come up with a plan that is being implemented for a short-term price cap on gas of $12. Now, $12
the member for Groom will leave the chamber under 94A.
96% previously of the prices being paid were under that, and the average price was around about $9.70 before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That has had a significant increase as a result of the changes.
Member Barker.
But it isn't just us saying that. This is what the Shadow Treasurer said about prices. We're facing circumstances in what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia, quote him, that were not expected and very hard to predict. These pressures are driven by extenuating circumstances. That's what the Shadow Treasurer had to say before the election about the pressure that was on as a result of global price increases, as a result of a land war in Europe and the fact that we're exposed to those international prices. Now, rather than sit back and do nothing, we acted. We acted responsibly. We brought in that legislation. And as a range of people have said, particularly in the manufacturing sector, this was the right thing to do. But those opposite voted against it. They voted against, or they're going to vote against, the National Reconstruction Fund. They were opposed to free TAFE. They were opposed to the electric vehicle discount. They opposed our climate bill. They were opposed to rewiring the nation. They opposed the Secure Jobs Bill. They opposed increasing the minimum wage.
Order.
They are defined by what they're against.
Order.
Because they never have a positive idea whatsoever, which is why opposition is an entirely appropriate title for a mob that are defined by what they're against, never by what they're for.
Order. Give the call to the honourable member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories. Why has the Albanese Labor government ordered an independent review into disaster funding? How will this benefit the Australian community?
Call the Minister for Regional Development, Local Government and Territories.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Macquarie for that question and acknowledge the great work she's doing in her community as it continues to recover from not only bushfires but multiple flooding events. I think every Australian who was impacted by the 2019-2020 bushfires would have been alarmed at the report that they read that the New South Wales government decided disaster recovery funding based on someone's postcode, not their need. Disasters aren't colour-coded, and it would be beneficial for communities if Liberals and Nationals understood that and supported everybody. The former Morrison government showed absolute disregard and arrogance for communities who had suffered catastrophic events, people who had lost everything. We saw how the previous government determined so many of their funds based on a colour-coded spreadsheet. My experience on the ground as a mayor following a major disaster was that people needed money quickly. They needed certainty that financial assistance was coming. What they told me, and what they definitely didn't need, was competitive grant funding, which pulled communities apart instead of bringing them together when they needed it. My friend, the member for Richmond, said yesterday there was a failed support in her area. They were denied extra funding support when they needed it the most. Natural disasters and their communities shouldn't be politicised. But we've seen this course of action time and time again from those opposite. It is the reason that our Prime Minister has announced an independent review into disaster funding arrangements. It will take forward the work the government is doing with states and territories to review the jointly funded disaster recovery funding arrangements. We do not need to see another repeat of a funding program that lacks transparency and integrity, another program where dollars flow out depending on your postcode. Because this country, Australia, was built on mateship, on helping out those in need when they need it, not on who you did or didn't vote for. The Albanese government will continue to clean up the mess caused by those opposite. We will implement funding that is fair and transparent, and we'll make sure it goes to the people who need it when they need it.
I give the call to the member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today we've seen a 9th consecutive interest rate rise, which will cause further pain for families with a mortgage. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the last time the cash rate was this high was when Labor was last in government? Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
I give the call to the Treasurer.
Well, it's disappointing, Mr Speaker, but not especially surprising, to learn from a rare question from the Shadow Treasurer that it hasn't dawned on him that interest rates started going up on their watch. The first interest rate rise of this cycle was in May of last year, when they were still in government.
Members on my
and
left.
more than that, Mr Speaker, the worst quarter for inflation last year was the March quarter. So in a difficult year for inflation, which was 7.8% in 2022, the biggest contribution in quarterly terms was the March quarter when those opposite were in office.
Member for Deakin.
And so, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the cost of living and the additional pressure placed on Australians and on the Australian economy by higher interest rates, one of the most important things that we can do as a government is to clean up the mess that the member for Hume left of our energy markets. And question after question from those opposite, about people who are doing it tough in this community ignores a very basic fact that when we asked the parliament to help people out and make their electricity bills a bit cheaper, they voted against it.
Order. The House will come to order. Members will cease interjecting so I can hear from the member for Hume on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. Australians want to know why their interest rates always go...
That is not a point of order. Because of the member's seniority, he won't be dealt with the same way as the member for Petrie. If you want to state a point of order, you do it shortly. You do not add additional comments. I hope that is very clear to the House, and I give the call to the Treasurer.
Sometimes I wonder, Mr Speaker, if the Roads Committee have asked for their money back. Mr Speaker,
the Treasurer will get on with his answer.
To explain it to the...
Order. I'll just get the manager to resume his seat. I'll deal with this. Members on my right, I want the Treasurer just to withdraw that comment and move on with his answer.
Withdrawn, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, to explain it to the Shadow Treasurer, one of the reasons we have higher interest rates, which began before the election, is because we have an inflation challenge in our economy, which we've acknowledged and we've got a plan to address. One of the reasons we've got that inflation challenge is because the combination of the member for Hume's incompetence and President Putin, Vladimir Putin's aggression in Ukraine means that we've got high and rising energy prices. And the point that I'm making about that, Mr Speaker, is that when the Parliament was given the opportunity, to look after Australians facing high energy prices as part of this inflation challenge, which is pushing up interest rates, those opposite were nowhere to be found. They were nowhere to be found. And the difference between this side of the House and that side of the House is we see cost of living pressures impacting on Australians and impacting on small business and impacting on our economy, and we do something about it. And those opposite just vote against it. If they had their way, Mr Speaker, we'd have another decade of wage suppression and wage stagnation and ordinary working people copping it in the neck. We understand this inflation problem in our economy. We understand the pressure that rising interest rates put on Australian families and the Australian economy more broadly. We've got a plan to deal with it, and part of that means cleaning up the mess that the member for Hume left us.
Give the call to the member for Hasluck.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development. In addition to disaster funding arrangements, what other grant programs has the Albanese Labor government reviewed since coming to office, and why has it been necessary to do so?
Give the call to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Local Government.
Thanks very much, and I thank the member for Hasluck for a question. She understands, as do most of us in this place, that it's a privilege and a responsibility to serve here that is entrusted to us by the Australian people. It is why, frankly, it is so incredibly disappointing that we have heard revelations that the former New South Wales minister made decisions on bushfire recovery grants that meant that money was directed away from Labor-affected electorates, using Commonwealth funds.
The Minister will resume her seat. And I'd like to hear the member for Riverina. I'm trying to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business. I'll give the call to the Manager.
We have heard two successive ministers speaking about decisions of the New South Wales government. This is not the Parliament of New South Wales. This is not within their responsibility. It's not a proper area for questions.
I just want to deal with this matter. The question was about reasons of being necessary, and that is a reasonable response for the minister to cover other levels of government in her answer. I'll listen to her carefully. If she strays from that, I will bring her into order. I give the call to the minister.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And we heard that the New South Wales Nationals directed money away from Labor electorates, finding that the minister's office changed the guidelines deliberately to do so, and that in fact made decisions that had significant conflicts of interest. But let's be clear, we know that bushfires do not care about what electorate you come from. But we also know that the National Party has form when it comes to this issue. The National Party has significant form when it comes to this issue. Can I be clear?
Members on my
if you
left
want to
will
look at how the National Party has form when it comes to this issue, program after program, rort after rort after rort. We know that when it came to the Building Better Regions Fund, the grants favoured the National Party electorates. They were not awarded on the basis of merit,
of the Nationals will cease
on the basis of rules that were not made clear to all applicants. This included, I'm sure members of the Liberal Party will be pleased to know, funneling $100 million away into National Party electorates against recommendations from the department that would have gone to Liberal Party seats. A lottery would have in fact been fairer. We saw it with community development grants, initially set up in 2013 to fund election commitments, as often happens. But what we then saw is suddenly popping up Pauline Hanson with novelty checks in Rockhampton, a state One Nation candidate in WA doing the same. We saw that. It was $3.2 billion of commitments, 1,400 plus commitments across the country, no application rounds, no transparency, no assessment of grants. We saw female facilities and water program, the water stream as well. 41 different programs and projects announced during the election, Only 21 actually went to female change rooms, in fact, including to one club that didn't actually have any women's teams playing as well. We saw it with the Regional Growth Fund. We saw it with the community support infrastructure grants, of course, the colour-coded spreadsheets. We saw it with the Drought Communities program. Time and time again, the National Party has used funds for its own political purposes. We are cleaning up the mess left by the National Party, but it shows why they should never be in charge of these portfolios ever again.
Order. The minister's time has expired. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member. The member for Riverina is warned. The House will come to order, so I can hear from the member for Clark, and he has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Productivity Commission recommends mandatory poker machine pre-commitment to address gambling addiction, and the New South Wales Crime Commission recommends the system be cashless to reduce money laundering. To that end, and to their great credit, the Tasmanian and New South Wales governments have committed to mandatory cashless pre-commitment poker machine cards. Prime Minister, this is a watershed moment. Will you seize it? Will you take the lead and drive deep reform nationally?
I give the call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Clark for his question and recognise his genuine position over a long period of time in public office on these issues. Everyone in this place knows the damage the problem gambling can cause to families and to communities. Everyone knows also, tragically, that too often it's those who can least afford it are those who are impacted by it. And the stats tell the story that on a per capita basis we have higher gambling losses than any other country in the world. We know that the amount of people experiencing gambling harm has increased as well over the last decade. And as the member knows, so states have, as he said, have responsibility for these issues. So, the member raises Tasmania and New South Wales as examples. WA government has measures in place as well, very strong measures. These are decisions for state governments, but the federal government does have a role when it comes to gambling. My government is working with state governments in a cooperative fashion. The Minister for Social Services had convened the first meeting of state and territory ministers with the Commonwealth about online wagering that has been convened since 2017. Just stopped meeting, stopped considering these things for the last, most of the last 2 terms of Parliament. Together, we're working on strengthening the National Consumer Protection Framework for online gaming, which the Commonwealth does have responsibility for. We recognise that there is more work to do. In addition to that, we've supported a House of Representatives committee to conduct an inquiry into online gaming, and we'll consider the recommendations from this committee after it has reported. And certainly I look forward to working with the member for Clark and other members, not just of the committee, but of the Parliament on these issues.
Give the call to the honourable member for Parramatta.
Is to the Minister for Workplace Relations. Since passing the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act last year, how has the Albanese Labor government delivered on its commitment to get wages moving again by reinvigorating enterprise bargaining?
Give a call to the Minister for Employment, Workplace Relations and Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Parramatta for the question. It's surprising that we're able to have this conversation because we were all assured last year by Senator Cash that we were about to close down Australia. But we apparently are all still here. And when we said we would get wages moving and we said we'd get bargaining moving, it's happening. It is happening. So some changes have already taken effect with that in mind from the Secure Jobs Better Pay Bill. The highly politicised ABCC is no more. The gender equality and job security are now objects of the Fair Work Act. The reforms to the equal remuneration provisions, which support the Commission to order wage increases to address unequal pay and undervalued work, in particular to address the gender pay gap, are now law, fully proclaimed. Pay secrecy provisions have now been prohibited so that people can find out on new contracts whether or what they're allowed to say, how much they earn. The amendments to the anti-discrimination provisions have taken effect. The provisions on the termination of enterprise agreements, where they used to just be able to go on forever, those provisions have taken effect. Making it easier to initiate bargaining has started. Dealing with errors in enterprise agreements can now be done sensibly without a mountain of red tape. And communications and materials from the Fair Work Commission, as was moved during one of the amendments, now have to be available in multiple languages. Importantly, as well as that, only last week the provisions for family and domestic violence leave became law in Australia, in what is world-leading legislation. But some of the provisions that have not yet taken effect have already had an impact, and I refer specifically to the multi-employer bargaining provisions. While the multi-employer bargaining provisions don't start for a few months, there are a number of businesses that made clear that they didn't want to be involved in multi-employer bargaining, and of course we said the likely behaviour that would happen would be single enterprise agreements would start to take off as a result of secure jobs, better pay being law. That's exactly what's happened. So Coles, for example, who had refused to bargain and had not been at the bargaining table for some time, have said that they are, quote, committed to working collaboratively throughout the process of renewing their agreements this year. That's nearly 3 years after the last enterprise agreement had nominally expired. Similarly, ANZ, after 7 years of not being at the bargaining table, are at the bargaining table again. I welcome the positive engagement from those businesses. I welcome the fact that we said we'd bring people to the table, and they are at the table negotiating and bargaining again. We said we'd get wages moving, and it's happening.
I give the call to the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week we learned that the CFMEU donated $4.3 million to Labor. This government has already abolished the Australian Building Construction Commission in exchange. What else are the corrupt CFMEU going to get from this government for their donations?
I'm just going to ask the manager to rephrase that question, particularly with the word of corrupt involved. I'll give him another chance to rephrase the question.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Last week we learned the CFMEU donated $4.3 million to the Labor Party. This government has already abolished the Australian Building Construction Commission in exchange. What else are the CFMEU going to get from this government for their donation?
Yeah, just resume your seat. Order. Going to hear from the Leader of the House. Order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I want to hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, to the reference in standing orders to references to improper motives, the question you asked for it to be rephrased. As Manager of Opposition Business, he always would have known that it was outside the standing orders when he asked it the first time. He's now, having been asked to say it a second time, is repeating the deliberate breach. And I draw it to your attention for a ruling.
Order. I'm going to give the Manager of Opposition one more time. If he pushes this, the question will be ruled out and we'll move on to the other side immediately.
My question to the Prime Minister. Last week we learned the CFMEU donated $4.3 million to the Labor Party. This government has already abolished the Australian Building Construction Commission. What else are the CFMEU going to get from this government?
Order. Order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting, otherwise we'll move on. The member for McEwen will cease interjecting as well. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, that preamble can only be part of the same question if it's in breach of standing orders.
Yeah. I have... Yep, on the point of order, I'll hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
On the point of order, the offending words on your advice, in my interpretation, were in exchange, and the word corrupt, which prefaced the word the CFMEU. The Shadow Minister took out the word "in exchange," so broke the nexus in terms of what he was trying to say in his question, and removed the word "corrupt" both on your instruction. And in that case, I don't see that. I know they're sensitive over this side, but it is not a breach of the standing orders to ask that question, particularly given the last part of the question, which is what the manager of the Leader of the House is arguing, is that what else are the CFMEU going to get from this government for their donations? I mean, that is not in breach of the standing orders.
Order. The House will come to order. I have tried to be reasonable with this. Members are entitled to ask questions. The Leader of the Opposition just demonstrated, in my opinion, why the question is out of order. I'm moving to the next question. Order. I'm calling the member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for the Environment. The State of the Environment report found that nature in Australia is in a poor state and deteriorating. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to reverse this trend to protect and repair Australia's environment?
The call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Gilmore, who represents one of the most beautiful parts of Australia and does it as a fierce advocate for the environment in her electorate. Of course, our government is getting on with our goal of delivering a nature-positive Australia. A nature-positive Australia, which means protecting more of our natural environment for our kids and our grandkids to enjoy, protecting more of what's precious, repairing more of what's damaged, and managing nature better for the future. What a contrast to a decade of neglect and destruction by those opposite. We saw what was in the State of the Environment report. We saw what was in the Water for the Environment special account. After we came into government, those opposite kept those secret. We know they received a report from Professor Graham Samuel about our broken environment laws. They didn't act on that. And of course, one of the best things they could have done to protect the environment is act on climate change. 22 separate energy policies, didn't land a single one. In contrast, we are protecting more of what is precious. We are introducing stronger laws to protect our environment. Better for nature, better for business. That's why the environment groups and business have welcomed that. We're setting up an Environment Protection Agency because we know we need a strong cop on the beat. We're working towards zero new extinctions with $250 million dedicated to that, including things like the Koala Hospital in Port Stephens in the member for Patterson's electorate. We're repairing more of what is damaged, establishing a nature repair market, restoring our urban rivers and waterways, including in Gilmore, $1.5 million for the Shoalhaven River there, blue carbon projects around Australia, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, mangroves, seagrass meadows, salt marshes restored. Eradicating feral cats on Christmas Island. It's so recycled minister there. We're managing nature better for the future,
Order.
cracking down on plastic pollution, investing in plastic recycling, as I said yesterday, doubling the number of Indigenous ranges. In the electorate of Lingiari, we're investing in Kakadu National Park, including building a new crocodile viewing platform.
Order.
And we're delivering on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan after a decade of deliberate sabotage from those opposite. This is just a small taste of what this government is doing to restore nature, to deliver on our nature-positive plan after a decade of destruction from those opposite.
Give the call to the honourable member for Ryan.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Last year, when asked about the proposed giant gas drilling project off the New South Wales coast, you said, and I quote, "Absolutely, we will stop PEP 11 going ahead, full stop, exclamation mark, no question, not equivocal, no ifs, no buts." Prime Minister, can you now guarantee you will stop this vandalism off New South Wales' beautiful coastline?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the member has actually followed the court case that has just happened, because the court case that just happened has shown that the issue there was that the minister who was due to make the decision, the now member for Hinkler, was usurped by the appointment by the Prime Minister as the minister in order to make a decision over the top of the known minister in order to make a different decision, because the minister for resources that we all knew about was going to make a different decision from the secret minister for resources. That is what has occurred there. There has been legal action to ensure that the decision be made in accordance with the law. This government will make decisions in accordance with the law, and that means that the one Minister for Resources that this government has, who you all know about, will make a decision on its merits as the law requires. To do otherwise is to ensure there will be another court case. So we will follow the law as it is designated, which gives the responsibility to the Minister for Resources to make this decision.
Good job. Give the call to the honourable member for Bean.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Government Services. At the recent public hearings of the Royal Commission into Robodebt, what have we learned about the inaccurate debts raised against innocent Australians?
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, that is not appropriate. Give the call to the Minister for Government Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I will update the House about how the Robodebt Royal Commission has discovered that the previous government expended almost $1 million to commission a report reviewing Robodebt in early 2017 by the former Minister for Human Services, how this report simply disappeared. Specifically, we've learned the following facts. On February 15, 2017, Pricewaterhouse was commissioned to do an independent review into Robodebt to be completed by the 30th of June. Secondly, according to AusTender, the contract allocated to Pricewaterhouse to review Robodebt was $939,244.90. It was paid. Thirdly, we've learned that engagements between Pricewaterhouse and senior DHS officers occurred more than weekly. The minutes of one of those meetings on March the 10th quote senior departmental representatives as saying, and I quote, "Political criticism has lost steam, and the Ombudsman report will say all aspects of the system are good. Further, the Minister is interested in what we have to do now. What can we press accelerator on in terms of recovery?" End quote. We further learned there was a visual presentation of this review provided to the former minister in mid-May 2017. It notes that the former minister's preference was to receive slides as he was a former consultant. We further learned that a final draft report was prepared at the end of May. It's about 93 pages long. It was dated June and it was promised to be delivered on June the 2nd. Then, nothing. Quite literally, I report to the House that nothing happened. This draft report was never sent. Apparently there was never any written request for it not to be sent or to be sent. It simply just disappeared. The trail went cold. $1 million was paid, but no report. So what we have, though, is the Royal Commission has now found what $1 million report looks like, and I'll table it. But no one can actually recall in the Royal Commission why the final report was never sent. $1 million of taxpayers' money and nothing. Literally nothing. Because of the Royal Commission, we've got the report, but the question which I think Australians want to know is why was the report really shelved? And I turn to the Royal Commission. They noted that whilst the draft report employed neutral language, It was actually a very damning indictment of DHS's system of debt recovery. The report said that the promises of the money to be saved were overstated. It reported the accuracy of the scheme was disastrous. It's a big shame that $1 million was spent on a report that was never tabled, but it's a bigger shame that we missed the opportunity to stop robo-debt 5 years ago.
I give the call to the member for Mallee.
My question is to the Prime Minister. The Food Supply Chain Alliance states Australia is short 172,000 workers from paddock to plate, driving up food prices. Why has this government mismanaged the Pacific Labour Scheme and shelved the ag visa, making this worker shortage worse? Why does Labor repeatedly make decisions which drive up the cost of living? Why do Australians always pay more under Labor?
Order. I give the call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks very much. I thank the member for her question, and the Minister for the Pacific with responsibility will respond to this. But we went to the election with a substantial upgrade of our engagement with Pacific Islands. Whether it's defence, whether it is migration, including temporary labour coming here, but also permanent migration to assist the Pacific, whether it be assisting with skills, assisting with maritime issues. We have re-engaged with the Pacific, and unlike what occurred just before the election when the Solomons broke away and came to arrangements that were not in Australia's national interest, not only have we signed agreements with Vanuatu and agreed to an agreement with Papua New Guinea when I was the first foreign leader of any sort to address the PNG Parliament in Port Moresby just last month. We are back around the table, not abusing our Pacific Island neighbours, not making jokes about climate change, but also engaging in these migration issues. And the Minister raises the ag visa that was a complete failure. We're a complete failure where no one came. Imagine making an announcement and nothing happens. Imagine that. That's what happened under them, and I'd ask the Minister to respond.
Well, the Minister for Defence Industry and International Development of the Pacific.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the Prime Minister. This question demonstrates the gross ignorance of the National Party when it comes to the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. I was proud to announce with the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister and others last week that we'd actually exceeded our goal for this year of PALM visa entrants. When we came to power, there were 24,000 Pacific workers under the PALM scheme. We set a goal in the October budget of reaching 35,000 by 30 June this year. We reached that target in December last year, demonstrating again our commitment
to the
Pacific and our commitment to agricultural workers and spreading the scheme to other industries such as aged care. This scheme delivers $15,000 per worker to Pacific Islanders in a region where more than 1/3 of people live on $1,000 a year or less. This scheme is working for the Pacific, it's working for industry that uses this scheme, and it's working to deepen our engagement in a region vital to our national interest and stands in stark contrast to the mismanagement and irresponsibility of those opposite who abandon our relationships in that region.
Mrs. Time has expired. I give the call to the honourable member for Bruce.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the excellent Minister for Health and Aged Care. What is the government doing to strengthen Medicare, and why is this needed?
Give the call to the Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bruce for his question because he understands acutely that it has never been harder to see a GP in Australia than it is right now, and it's never been more expensive. The average gap fee now for a standard GP consult, for the first time in the history of Medicare, is actually more than the Medicare rebate itself. And this doesn't just mean that Australians aren't getting the care that they need out in the community when and where they need it. It also means that there is huge pressure placed on our already stressed hospital emergency departments, which is why, of course, the Prime Minister and National Cabinet agreed last week to focus on health reform over the course of this year. Now, Mr Speaker, this crisis didn't just spring from thin air. This crisis is a product of deliberate decisions made by the former government. And, Mr Speaker, there is no person in Australia who bears more responsibility for the crisis in general practice than the now Leader of the Opposition, a man rightly voted by Australia's doctors as the worst health minister in the Medicare era. We remember, Mr Speaker, after promising in 2013 there would be no cuts to health, his first budget as health minister tried to slash $50 billion from hospital funding and slug every single Australian, every pensioner, every child, every concession card holder with a GP tax for every single visit to the doctor. And then, after we blocked that radical, that extremist agenda in the Senate, instead he imposed a freeze on the Medicare rebate that lasted 6 long years and cut billions and billions of dollars out of general practice. But now, once again, Mr Speaker, it falls to a new Labor government to start fixing up the mess the coalition always leaves in healthcare, to fix the vandalism to a system of universal healthcare cherished by the Australian people but has always been hated by the Liberal and National parties. Mr Speaker, we are getting on with the job of strengthening Medicare. Just last week, the Prime Minister and I were in Perth with the Western Australian Health Minister, Amber Jade Sanderson, opening expressions of interest for the 7 urgent care centres that we promised the people of Western Australia. Centres that will be delivered this year, that will be open 7 days a week from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. and will completely be free of charge, fully bulk billed. Every single state and territory government, Liberal and Labor alike, Mr Speaker, have cooperated deeply with us on this program because they understand urgent care clinics won't just make it easier and cheaper to see a doctor when people need it, it will take much-needed pressure off their hospital system. Fixing 9 years of cuts and neglect doesn't happen overnight, but this government has no higher priority than strengthening Medicare.
The call to the Prime Minister.
I'd ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Order. Members can take their seats or leave the chamber quickly and quietly. We'll move to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the honourable member for Deakin proposing that a definite matter of public importance be submitted to the House